What holds this progression together is the line made by the bottom notes of the chords. This line of bass notes, this bass line, is as strong an organizer as the circle. So, in many tunes, the progression can be taken off the circle and the chords put on a bass line. You can look on this bass line as the bottom of a sandwich, a bottom made of notes that come along alphabetically. The top of the sandwich is the melody line. And the filling of the sandwich is chord notes. Which chord notes? Why, any chord notes at all, just as long as the chord includes the bass note and sounds good with the melody. When it comes to holding a chord progression together, a bass line is just as strong as the circle, and that's true for classical music as well as popular. Take Johann Sebastian Bach and his Minuet in G. Obviously, he wrote it with the circle pulling his chords along. But a bass line will pull the chords along just as firmly, though they won't be the same chords that Bach used. For some reason or other, there's a widespread prejudice against playing by ear.
Pardon me, officer. Can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?
Of course I can tell you how to get to Carnegie Hall. Practice, man, practice.
The theory seems to be that music played by ear is somehow inferior to music played exactly as the composer wrote it.
Practice your notes, practice your scales, practice your exercises. Learn to read the printed score. Note perfect.
But why anybody should feel that way about playing by ear is very hard to understand.
Practice Hannen, Czerny, at least an hour a day. Learn Mozart, Beethoven. Perfect. Perfect.
The plain fact is, a lot of popular music can't be played exactly as the composer wrote it, because a composer didn't write it at all. On the contrary, it may have been whistled, hummed, tootled, and noodled by an assortment of singers, lyricists, instrumentalists, band leaders, publishers, and recording stars, and then turned over to an arranger who wrote down the final product. And as for classical music by the great and not so great composers, well, the awful truth is that classical composers don't write music until they play it by ear, and play it by ear quite a few times.
So, what's all the fuss about playing by ear? If you want to play by ear, stick around.
Don't get me wrong, there's nothing the matter with playing music. Printed arrangements are fine if that's what you want. But this course has been about making your own music. And you've been making it out of 3 simple ingredients. You began with a tune, a melody. Then you put some chords with it. Then you create an arrangement with it using all sorts of devices. And that, it turns out, is also the description of playing by ear, with a couple of small differences. In playing by ear, you recreate the melody from your mind without using printed music. you decide on which chords to use in your arrangement. And neither of those two items is very hard to do, as you'll see. Okay, the first item is the tune. To begin playing by ear, you have to recreate a tune from your mind without using printed music. And that means you have to know the melody all the way through. You can't recreate a tune from your mind if you don't have a tune in your mind.
In the halls of Montezuma, excavating for a mine. Oh, my darling, the United States Marines.
The next step, of course, is to sit down and start picking out the tune on the keyboard. And most important of all, expect to make a lot of mistakes along the way. Why you make mistakes is quite easy to see. The problem is that your mind isn't laid out like a piano, at least not yet. The distance from one note to another on the keyboard is different from the distances between notes in your mind. But the more tunes you fool around with and try to recreate on the keyboard, the easier it'll be for you to think in keyboard distances. In other words, you can learn to play melodies by ear. But for heaven's sake, don't start out with the most sophisticated tunes you can think of. If you want to get the hang of distances on the keyboard, pick out the simpler songs, Christmas carols, old-fashioned tunes, folk songs, and like that. Tunes like these are probably better fixed in your memory, and so are the lyrics, which are a great help in remembering both the tune and its rhythm. And just as important, or maybe more important, these simpler tunes usually start on one of the three notes of the home bass chord, the root, the third, or the fifth. When you know that a tune starts on one note or another of the basic chord, you've got great help in picking out the tune. And here's how it helps. Take Jingle Bells, for example. Jingle Bells starts on the third of the basic chord. If you started the tune on the root of the chord, say, you'd get into trouble right away. Now, that doesn't mean only the oldies start on a note of the basic chord. Very often, the standard popular tunes begin there too. Here's one that starts on the root. Picking out the tune is one half of playing by ear. The other half is putting chords with it. But that's no big deal. For one thing, you've already put the first chord with the tune, and the home bass chord at that. You used that chord to find the starting note of the tune, so you've got the home bass chord. And now the rest of the chords ought to be duck soup. That's because most of these older, simpler songs use the elementary chord progression, only home bass and its two next-door neighbors. Now, how do you know when to change chords? Why, that's easy. Just let your ear tell you when the melody notes clash with the chords. If you don't think your ear knows when the tune and chords clash, try this on your piano. When the tune clashes with the chords, try another chord. And how do you know which chord to change to? Well, your ear will tell you that too. After all, there are only 3 chords to choose from: home bass or one of its 2 neighbors. Besides, the melody notes you're playing will literally spell out a comfortable chord. Those notes, as you can see with your own eyes, spell out a familiar chord. And the chord they spell, obviously, is the basic F chord, which makes them most comfortable. But as the melody moves along, your ear will tell you that you need a new chord to make most melody notes comfortable. So you have to leave the home bass chord and move to another, in this case, a B-flat chord, which is what the melody notes spell out for your eyes and your ears. Naturally, the more you play by ear, the more your ears and eyes will tell you when to change chords and which chord to change to. And most of the time, your ear will find that an elementary chord progression does very nicely. In fact, an elementary progression will serve as the basic harmony for most tunes you play, even the more sophisticated songs. Once you're comfortable with this bare minimum chord progression, you can start to fool around with it. For openers, you can try a classical progression with a standard quarter circle jump backward and clockwise journey home, stop by stop on the circle. The last step in playing by ear, of course, is arranging the song. And you certainly have lots of ways to do that. Don't overlook the arrangement you give the song. It can make all the difference. Take Red River Valley, please. It's a big bore on a skeleton setting. And it's too fussy on an arpeggio. But it starts to sound a lot better with shuffle rhythm. All that with only a plain elementary chord progression, home bass and its 2 neighbors. But no law says you can't put the tune on a bass line, if that's how it sounds best to you. In fact, that's been the moral of this whole series from beginning to end.